So I'm here with Eli today. So glad to have Eli back this morning to help me with the camera and the computers. And we were thinking yesterday, putting service together, how sometimes there is just so much choice in life. The other day we were at Trader Joe's collecting some items to send for a holiday basket to Grandma and Grandpa up in rural Montana. They don't have Trader Joe's there. And there's such an array of choice. So we were saying that no matter what we chose, even though we knew what we chose would be terrific, there were hundreds of other options that we were not choosing. And maybe that's just a good lesson for life. So in thinking today about the extraordinary story of Dinah and Shechem and the brothers and the act of retribution that Jacob never forgives his sons for, but seems also suffering with the rest of his days, that's a whole other aisle of choices. The beautiful book of Ovadiah is another aisle of choices. But in the end, there is a personage, a new friend that I would like to introduce you to today that, despite all of the amazing choices, calls out to be welcomed to our circle today. So, Shabbat Shalom. We heard today the Haftarah that is the book of Ovadiah. Ovadiah means servant of God. And though we may be familiar, or are now, with the prophet Ovadiah, there is another Ovadiah in Jewish history with which I imagine most of us are not familiar. This gentleman, whose name became Ovadiah, is known to us only from the documents found in the Cairo Geniza. Just a tiny review of the Geniza. This particular Geniza in the Cairo Ben Ezra synagogue normally would have been sort of a recycling bin, a place for ritual objects to be stored until they could go to their final and proper resting place in a small burial ceremony. This Geniza in Cairo, for reasons that have yet to be uncovered and maybe never will be, was a repository of hundreds of thousands of documents from the Cairo Jewish community in the Middle Ages that included so much more than ritual items. It included doctors' prescriptions, children's homework, love letters, buying and selling lists, travel logs, legal documents, you name it, it was in the Geniza. And the Geniza was able to shed light on some incredibly famous people of the era. We learned about their personal lives, the lives of Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, Saadia Gaon, and many others, whose great works we had, but we didn't know much about their personal lives. And in the late 1800s, when the Geniza, which had sat there for hundreds of years, almost untouched, was opened to the world by Dr. Solomon Schechter with the help of two good friends, Margaret Gibson and Agnes Lewis. This opened a world that had previously been essentially dark and closed. The centuries between the 1000s and the 1200s were a period of enormous activity, creativity, mercantile activity in this part of the world. Cairo was literally the center of the world at that time. And very careful research, years of persistent research, piecing together fragmented documents comprising 7 folios of work scattered in Budapest, Cambridge, and New York in the primary but multiple Geniza collections, an individual came to life. We know him as Ovadiah haGer, Ovadiah the convert, or more elegantly, Ovadiah the proselyte, previously unknown prior to the Geniza work. Who was Ovadiah the proselyte? His born name was Johannes, And he was born around the year 1075 in the small town of Oppido Lucano, near Naples in southern Italy. Eli, would you be good enough to show a picture of Oppido Lucano and what remains of the medieval streets where Johannes was a child? Take a look at those for a minute. It's okay. Thank you, honey. So we'll just dial ourselves back 1,000 years. As was common at the time, Johannes's older twin brother, make a note of that, his older twin brother Rogerius was trained for military service and became a wealthy baron, employing an entourage that included many servants and guards. But Johannes, as the younger twin, was guided, as was the practice for the second child, to the priesthood. A fragment of his memoir found in Budapest in the 1950s records that when he was 12 years old, he had a strange dream in which he saw himself as a priest serving at the local basilica, where a strange man approached him, called him Johannes, and told him to perform a religious act. Now, scholars disagree about this dream. One primary scholar believes he had the dream some years later, upon actually being ordained to the priesthood. Either way, shortly after this experience, Johannes's parents enrolled him in a monastery to study for the priesthood. Trying as best he could to focus on his studies, he writes that his dream persisted. There is a suggestion that the man in Johannes's dream was possibly a saintly figure, perhaps even Archbishop Andreas of Bari, who died in 1078, who himself had converted to Judaism, and in whose footsteps Johannes was destined to follow. There is another suggestion based on Johannes's later writings that the person he saw in his dream was actually Moses, our Moses himself. At any rate, Johannes did enter the monastery, and he emerged a priest. The Geniza documents that we have about Ovadiah's life are extraordinary. Just a little taste today and why it's so easy to fall in love with this man who became Ovadiah, the proselyte. He carried with him a letter from Rabbi Baruch ben Yitzchak. It was a letter written by this Rabbi Baruch, a rabbinic authority of the day, who became a personal mentor and guide to Ovadiah. He wrote a letter for Ovadiah that attested to his conversion in language that mirrors exactly the process for conversion laid out centuries earlier in the Talmud. Ovadiah was a bona fide converted Jew, and the letter with which he traveled, because he was a man of resources, he traveled throughout the world of the Middle Ages with this letter in hand, which gained him entree to Jewish communities along the way and opened his eyes to the experience of Jews in the Middle Ages in multiple lands. The letter is marvelous because it describes his deep desire to come to Judaism, the way that the rabbis tested him quite mightily. Are you sure, Johannes, the priest, that you want to join this ragtag group of desert people known as the Jews? It's described that he was reminded how difficult it can be to be a Jew in a hostile world. He is reminded of the commandments, positive and negative, for which he will now be responsible, where in his old life he could have eaten whatever he wanted and done what he wanted on the Jewish Sabbath without fear of recrimination or punishment. Now he would be held responsible. And over again, Ovadiah said, I wish to be a Jew. Once they had determined his sincerity, he was circumcised. When he healed from his circumcision, I'm thinking about today's Torah portion and the men of Shechem who were circumcised of their own will and then slaughtered. But Johannes, as he became Ovadiah, was circumcised of his own will and when he recovered, he was fully immersed in a mikveh and welcomed with open arms to the Jewish community of his day. Another Geniza fragment, multiple fragments, include Ovadiah's Sidur. He wrote a prayer book in a time when paper was available but very expensive and books almost unheard of. This is hundreds of years before the printing press. And he wrote his own Sidur. It is thought that he did that so as to be an exercise whereby he could learn the prayers. And one of the fragments of the Geniza that we have is his version. We don't know if it was his or the version of the time, because prayer books are very scarce from that era, of the evening prayer, the Ma'ariv Aravim that we say every Friday night together in praise of the cosmos. But Ovadiah has either his own version or a window into what the version of that prayer was in the 10th and 11th century. It's remarkable. There is another marvelous piece that is only in fragments that describes the experience, the terror of the Jews in Europe as the first Crusades were picking up speed. He describes the fear and the overwhelming anxiety, the absolute terror in the faces and the souls of the Jewish people that he encountered as they donned crucifixes and swore allegiance to the church, even though they were ultimately to be doomed. He saw in that activity, that terrible time, a sign for him not to run away from Judaism, but actually to run toward it, to embark on his own pilgrimage, to embrace Judaism, come what may, and whatever was coming around the corner. We have testimony of Ovadiah's experience in Baghdad when he took that letter from Rabbi Baruch and spent time with the Baghdadi Jewish community, the Babylonian Jewish community of the time. This one I'll read just a little bit to you because it's a window into life for the Jews in that era, in that time. He writes, "The vizier decreed that Jews should wear 2 yellow badges, one on their headgear and one on the neck. Furthermore, each Jew should have hanging on his neck a piece of lead weighing 1 dirham, a silver coin from the time, on which the word dhimmi, non-Muslim, was engraved. The Jew should also wear a belt around his waist. On the women, 2 distinctive signs were imposed. They should wear 1 red shoe and 1 black shoe, and have a small brass bell on their necks or shoes in order to distinguish them from Muslim women. The vizier appointed brutal Muslim men to supervise the Jewish males and Muslim women to watch over the females and to harm them with curses and humiliations. The Muslims mocked the Jews, and the mob and their youngsters beat them up in the streets of Baghdad." Ovadiah's heart and soul were open to his Jewish brothers and sisters, whom he embraced with full heart, with full mind, and with full soul. In the document attesting to his proper halachic conversion, the rabbi even used the language of the V'ahavta, that this man, Ovadiah haGer, comes to Judaism b'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha, with all of his heart, soul, and might. He was given permission to move freely among the Jewish communities, and they were reminded to never remind him, as is prescribed in the Talmud, of his origins or his background, the things he used to eat and the practices he used to embrace. He was a full member of the Jewish people, and oh my goodness, were we fortunate to count him among our numbers. But Ovadiah haGer was something else as well. He was a musician. We have a piece of music. Eli, would you show it, please? A poem that Ovadiah set to music. But it wasn't just music. This reflected the precursor of what would become the 5-note music staff, which was not in use in his era. What Ovadiah did was drew on his experience in the monastery and in the priesthood and used the pneumatic notations that we associate still to this day with Gregorian chant, and he applied them to a beautiful poem called Mi al Har Chorev. This piece of music that you see on the screen is considered the oldest piece of Jewish sheet music. No small wonder why I am absolutely taken with Ovadiah haGer. He was a true servant of God, and the gift he gave to us in the documents discovered in the Geniza cannot be overstated. This beautiful poem that you see, I'll invite us to listen to it at the very end of service today. We'll go back in time to have a sense of medieval music and the fusion of these two worlds, the music of the church and the words of the Jewish people, that combined together in the person of Ovadiah haGer. Shabbat Shalom. I got so excited thinking about Ovadiah haGer that I forgot to bring him back around to yet another set of reasons why he was so compelling for today. I dropped just a hint of it. As you heard, he was the younger twin, and his life was very much determined by the fact that he was the twin to come out second. He, of course, had a huge name change, not an adjustment of his original name, but an absolutely new name change. And we might imagine that he went through quite a bit of wrestling with himself, wrestling with ideas, maybe even some wrestling with an angel. So, of course, he was the ideal person to think of today as we continue to tell the story of our father Jacob. Jacob, who was the second younger twin and whose life was utterly marked by that birth order, who underwent an entire name change from Jacob to Israel, though of course he's still called Jacob, back and forth to the rest of his days. And of course, this week's Parsha, where Jacob wrestles with that angel, or himself, or the shadow of Esav, or we fill in the blanks that the Torah leaves for us, those marvelous mysteries that we are still ourselves wrestling with. So with that tribute, Ovadiah fits beautifully into our story and is a marvelous reminder of the story and personage of Jacob himself. We'll close today not with our usual closing hymn, but going back to Ovadiah's beautiful piece of music from the Middle Ages. It's 6 minutes, so you can just let it run if you like, or just sit and breathe it in. We didn't find an easy way to clip it shorter, so I give you a heads up. But this is a poem of unknown provenance, so we don't know from where it comes or who wrote it. It is not suggested that Ovadiah wrote it, but this piece that became the oldest piece of Jewish sheet music is a poem called Mi al Har Chorev. Who stood upon Mount Horeb, heard the order, stand with me, like Moses did? Who to the desert led my flock, fed them manna, drew from out of my well, like Moses did? Who praised me with, O merciful and forbearing, whispered, thou repentest of the evil, like Moses did? Who beheld the sight of statute testimonial, witnessed in full vision, not by parable, like Moses did? Who is that one who taught and drilled the Torah, merited to come within the cloud, like Moses did. Who stayed for 40 days in heaven was sustained with neither bread nor water, like Moses did. And the people hearkened unto the Lord. My congregation, arise, for thy light hath come, and the glory of the Eternal on thee doth shine. As it is said, Arise, O my light, for thy light hath come, and the glory of the Lord on thee doth shine. I wish you Shabbat Shalom, all good health and blessings, and we will say farewell today with Ovadiah haGer's musical medieval setting of Mi al Har Chorev. Be well.